The house stood waiting at the end of Maple Street, a Victorian relic with peeling paint and sagging porches that seemed to mirror Eleanor's own exhaustion. 6 months had passed since the funeral, and the silence in her tidy apartment had grown from peaceful to profound. Her husband's pension barely covered groceries, let alone the rising rent. Every morning, she'd open the checkbook and feel that familiar tightening in her chest, the numbers never quite adding up to security. The real estate listing called it a handyman's special, which was a generous way of saying it was the only house in town she could afford. Eleanor walked through the empty rooms that first time, her footsteps echoing on scarred hardwood floors. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light coming through windows that hadn't been washed in years. The air smelled of damp plaster and forgotten things. In the basement, her flashlight beam swept across concrete walls and exposed joists. That's when she saw it, a door unlike any other in the house. Not wood, but heavy steel, set flush against the foundation wall and painted the same drab gray as the concrete. No handle, no visible hinges, just a seamless metal surface that seemed completely out of place in the 100-year-old basement. She ran her fingers along the cool surface, finding no seam or latch. The closing happened quickly, a transaction conducted with the weary efficiency of people who knew this wasn't a dream home, but a last resort. When the keys finally clicked in the old lock, Eleanor stood in the empty foyer, surrounded by boxes containing her simplified life. This house represented more than shelter. It was her final stand against the financial despair that had been creeping closer every month. That first night, she slept on a mattress on the floor of what would become her bedroom. The old house settled around her with groans and creaks that sounded like a language she needed to learn. Outside her window, the neighborhood slept quietly, unaware that the widow in the neglected Victorian was about to uncover secrets that had been waiting 50 years for someone brave enough to find them. The first month in the house felt like watching money disappear into a bottomless pit. Eleanor's modest savings evaporated faster than she could track, replacing the ancient water heater, repairing the leaky roof, dealing with electrical wiring that seemed to belong in a museum rather than a home. Every repair revealed two more problems hiding behind the walls, each one with a price tag that made her stomach tighten. She learned to patch drywall herself, to fix dripping faucets with YouTube tutorials. But some things required professionals who expected to be paid in actual dollars rather than gratitude. Her neighbors watched with the quiet curiosity of people who'd seen other owners come and go. Mrs. Gable from across the street brought over a casserole and a warning. "That house has always been troubled," she said, her voice dropping as if the walls might be listening. "The family that built it vanished back in the 70s, just disappeared one night. People say strange things still happen here." Eleanor thanked her for the food and the warning, though she dismissed the latter as small-town superstition. She had enough real problems without worrying about ghost stories. The financial anxiety became a constant companion, more persistent than the drafts that whistled through the old window frames. She'd lie awake at night, calculating how many months she could survive if the furnace failed completely, or if the foundation needed work. The house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautiful trap, its Victorian charm masking a constant demand for resources she didn't have. It was during one of these anxious nights, unable to sleep, that she found herself in the basement with a flashlight, mentally cataloging all the repairs she couldn't afford. The beam of light swept across the foundation wall, past the strange steel door she'd noticed during her first walkthrough. But this time, something caught her eye, a section of wall near the door that didn't quite match the rest. The texture was slightly different, the concrete appearing newer, almost like it had been patched over something. She might have missed it entirely if the angle of her flashlight hadn't caught the subtle variation in the surface. Eleanor ran her fingers over the suspicious section of wall, comparing it to the surrounding concrete. The difference was subtle but definite. This patch felt smoother, colder somehow. She retrieved a hammer and chisel from her toolbox, her hands trembling slightly with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The first tap against the wall sounded unnaturally loud in the silent basement, echoing through the empty rooms above. The concrete came away more easily than she expected, crumbling around the edges to reveal not more foundation, but what appeared to be old wooden shelving units built right into the wall. They were cobweb covered and thick with dust, but clearly deliberate construction. Behind the lowest shelf, her fingers found something metal, a small, discreet lever mechanism hidden in the shadows where no casual observer would ever notice it. She hesitated, remembering Mrs. Gable's warning about the house's troubled history, but curiosity overpowered caution. She pulled the lever, and with a soft click and the sound of grinding mechanisms, the heavy steel door swung inward silently, as if it had been oiled recently. The air that rushed out was cool and carried the unmistakable scent of old paper, dust, and something else, the metallic tang of secrets long buried. The space beyond was pitch black, smaller than she expected. Her flashlight beam revealed a room no larger than a walk-in closet, walls lined with empty shelves except for one item sitting alone in the center of the floor. A metal box, about the size of a small suitcase, rusted around the edges but still solid. The floor was thick with dust that swirled in the beam of her light, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling like ancient curtains. Eleanor stood at the threshold, one foot in her familiar basement, the other poised to step into this hidden space that shouldn't exist. Her heart hammered against her ribs, part of her wanting to close the door and pretend she never found it. Another part desperately curious about what someone had gone to such trouble to hide. The metal box seemed to pulse with silent stories in the darkness, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. Eleanor knelt before the metal box, her knees pressing into the dust of the hidden room. The rusted lock resisted her first tentative pull, but gave way with a sharp crack when she applied more pressure with her pry bar. The lid creaked open reluctantly, releasing a scent that was unmistakable. Old paper, fading ink, and the ghost of lavender sachets that had long since lost their fragrance. Inside, the contents were neatly organized, preserved in the dry, dark space for decades. The top layer contained bundles of letters, each tied with faded ribbon that felt brittle beneath her fingers. The handwriting varied, some elegant and flowing, others tight and anxious, but all addressed to someone named Thomas Wheeler at this address. Beneath the letters lay financial documents that made her breath catch, bank statements showing deposits and withdrawals of amounts that seemed impossible for the 1970s. $5,000 here, $10,000 there, all in cash. The dates clustered around March of 1972, then stopped abruptly. At the very bottom, wrapped in delicate tissue paper, was a photograph. A family smiled up at her, a man with kind eyes and a slight frown, a woman with her hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a boy about 10 years old. They stood on the very porch Eleanor now owned, but the house behind them looked different. Freshly painted, with flowering plants in boxes under the windows. These weren't the people listed in the property records she'd seen at closing. These were strangers, frozen in a moment of happiness that clearly hadn't lasted. The names from the letters, Thomas, Margaret, and Daniel Wheeler, became Eleanor's obsession. She spent days at the local library, scrolling through microfiche records of old newspapers, her fingers growing smudged with ink. The Wheeler family appeared in society pages throughout 1971, Thomas winning a Rotary Club award, Margaret organizing a charity drive, Daniel making the honor roll at Maple Elementary. Then, in April of 1972, nothing. No announcements, no mentions, just silence. The property records told an even stranger story. According to official documents, the house had been abandoned in May 1972 and remained empty for 3 years before being sold at auction. But there were no missing persons reports, no police investigations mentioned in any newspaper archives. It was as if the Wheelers had simply vanished into thin air, and the town had collectively decided to forget they ever existed. Eleanor visited the county clerk's office, where an elderly clerk with thick glasses helped her pull the original transfer documents. The Andersons bought it in '75, the woman said, squinting at the faded paperwork. Paid cash, well below market value. Strange transaction, now that I look at it. She pointed at the signature line. The seller was a holding company, not the original owners. I remember my dad saying something about that family. Said they got mixed up with the wrong people. The mystery deepened when Eleanor checked school records. Daniel Wheeler's file ended abruptly in March 1972 with a simple notation, transferred. No forwarding address, no new school listed. The family doctor's office had no records after that same month. It was a complete erasure, professionally done, as if the Wheelers had never been part of the community at all. The bank statements from the metal box revealed a pattern that made Eleanor's financial training kick in. Thomas Wheeler had been making regular cash deposits of exactly $9,500 every 2 weeks throughout 1971, always on a Friday, always at the same branch of First National Bank. The withdrawals were more erratic, large sums taken out in cash, sometimes $20,000 or $30,000 at a time, with no indication of where the money went. The most disturbing entries clustered in February and March of 1972. A single deposit of $50,000 on February 15th, followed by a withdrawal of $45,000 the same day. Then another $25,000 deposit on March 3rd, withdrawn in full that afternoon. The final transaction was on March 28, 1972, a withdrawal of every remaining cent in the account, leaving a balance of $0.00. The account was never closed, just emptied and abandoned. The dates aligned perfectly with the Wheeler family's disappearance. Eleanor spread the documents across her kitchen table, the numbers telling a story of someone who came into sudden money, then suddenly needed even more. The amounts were too large for ordinary household expenses, too regular to be random windfalls. This was structured, deliberate movement of cash that suggested something far more organized than a family facing financial trouble. She noticed the payee line on the withdrawal slips was always blank or contained only vague notations like investment or services. The bank teller stamps showed different initials each time, suggesting whoever was handling these transactions made sure not to deal with the same employee twice. This wasn't just money moving in and out of an account. This was someone trying to avoid leaving a paper trail while handling amounts that would be equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars today. Eleanor sat back, the pieces starting to form a picture she didn't like. The Wheelers hadn't just vanished. They'd been involved in something that required large amounts of cash and extreme discretion. And whatever that something was, it might explain why they disappeared so completely that spring of 1972. The first call came on a Tuesday evening, just as Eleanor was sorting through the Wheeler documents at her kitchen table. The phone rang with that particular shrillness that only landlines seem to master, startling her from her concentration. When she answered, there was only silence on the line, followed by a soft click. She dismissed it as a wrong number or faulty connection, but the timing felt strangely coincidental. 2 nights later, she noticed a dark sedan parked across the street, its engine off but a faint glow from a cigarette visible in the driver's seat. It remained there for over an hour before driving away slowly. Eleanor told herself it was probably someone waiting for a date or avoiding going home, but the car returned the following evening, parked in the same spot at the same time. She began drawing her curtains after sunset, something she'd never done before. At the library, while researching old property records, she asked the reference librarian about the Wheeler family. The woman's friendly demeanor vanished instantly. "Some questions are better left unanswered," she said quietly, glancing around the empty reference section. "This town has long memories, and some histories are best left buried." When Eleanor pressed her, the librarian simply shook her head and walked away, her earlier helpfulness replaced by clear discomfort. The feeling of being watched became a constant presence. At the grocery store, she'd catch strangers looking at her a moment too long. While gardening in her front yard, cars would slow down slightly as they passed her house. She started noticing small things. A gate she'd left closed would be slightly ajar, a basement window that seemed to have fresh fingerprints on the glass. Her initial curiosity about the Wheelers began mixing with a growing sense of unease that settled in her stomach like a cold stone. Returning to the hidden room, Eleanor decided to search more thoroughly. Kneeling on the dusty floor, she ran her hands along the baseboards until her fingers found what her eyes had missed: a loose floorboard beneath a layer of accumulated grime. Beneath it lay a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft with age but remarkably preserved in the dry darkness. The first entry was dated January the 5th, 1972. Thomas Wheeler's handwriting was precise and measured, describing his furniture business struggling through the economic downturn. "The banks have refused further credit," he wrote. "Margaret doesn't know how close we are to losing everything. Daniel's tuition payment is due next week." By February, the entries grew more desperate. "Met with representatives from the Crawford family today. They offered a solution to our financial problems, but the terms make me uneasy. They call it an arrangement, but it feels like selling my soul." The following entry mentioned a $50,000 deposit that matched the bank statement Eleanor had found. "The money arrived as promised. Margaret thinks I secured a business loan. I couldn't tell her the truth. How could I explain that we're now indebted to the most powerful family in the state?" March entries showed a man unraveling under pressure. "The arrangement requires more than I anticipated. They want me to move money through the business, to provide services I don't understand. Today, they asked about using the warehouse for storage. When I hesitated, Mr. Crawford reminded me how easily they could take everything away." The final week of entries made Eleanor's blood run cold. "They've increased their demands, the things they're asking me to facilitate. I can't be part of this. told Crawford I wanted out of the arrangement. He smiled that cold smile and said, "Nobody leaves the arrangement." Margaret says she's seen strange cars watching the house. I think I've put my family in danger. The last entry, dated March 27, 1972, contained only 5 words. "They're coming tonight. God help us." The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible, as if written in tremendous haste or fear. Eleanor sat back on her heels, the journal feeling heavy with tragedy in her hands. She was holding Thomas Wheeler's final words, written hours before his family vanished forever. Eleanor began researching the Crawford name that appeared throughout Thomas's journal. What she discovered explained the librarian's warning and the strange surveillance she'd been experiencing. The Crawford family weren't just wealthy. They were woven into the very fabric of the town's power structure, with tentacles reaching into every important institution. Lawrence Crawford Sr. had built his fortune in manufacturing during the 1950s, but the business had diversified into real estate development, banking, and transportation. His son, Lawrence Jr., now ran the empire with what newspaper profiles called ruthless efficiency. The family owned the local newspaper, held controlling interest in 2 banks, and had contributed to every mayoral campaign for 30 years. Deeper digging revealed a pattern of complaints and investigations that never seemed to go anywhere. A former business partner who accused them of intimidation had withdrawn his lawsuit unexpectedly. A zoning commissioner who opposed one of their developments resigned abruptly for personal reasons. The few people who spoke against the Crawfords in newspaper quotes always seemed to retract their statements later or disappear from public life. At the Historical Society, an elderly volunteer lowered his voice when Eleanor mentioned the Crawford name. "They built this town, but they own it too," he said, glancing around the empty room. "My father used to say the Crawfords don't break laws, they just make new ones that benefit themselves. If Thomas Wheeler got mixed up with them..." He trailed off, suddenly finding something very interesting in the papers on his desk. Property records showed the Crawfords owned dozens of parcels around town, many purchased through holding companies with opaque ownership structures. Eleanor cross-referenced the dates and found something chilling. Several properties had been acquired shortly after their previous owners faced financial difficulties or legal problems. The pattern suggested a machine that methodically identified vulnerable targets and absorbed their assets. The most disturbing discovery came from old newspaper archives. In the months following the Wheelers' disappearance, the Crawfords had acquired several properties at auction, including a warehouse that had belonged to Thomas Wheeler's furniture business. The purchase price was listed as undisclosed, but tax assessments showed it was a fraction of the property's actual value. 3 days after her visit to the Historical Society, a black luxury sedan pulled into Eleanor's driveway. The man who emerged wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than her monthly mortgage payment. He moved with the calm assurance of someone accustomed to doors opening for him. "Mrs. Eleanor Price?" he asked when she answered the door, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I'm Robert Hayes, representing the Crawford family interests. May I come in?" He sat at her kitchen table without waiting for an invitation, his gaze taking in the Wheeler documents spread across the surface. "I understand you've been doing some research into the previous owners of this property. The Crawford family has always taken an interest in historical preservation in our community." His offer was delivered with polished professionalism. The Crawfords were prepared to purchase her house at twice its market value, with all closing costs covered and a generous bonus for her trouble. This is a generous offer, he said, sliding a contract across the table, and it includes a non-disclosure agreement, standard in these matters. We could have you settled in a lovely new condominium by the end of the month. When Eleanor hesitated, mentioning her attachment to the house and her curiosity about its history, Hayes's demeanor shifted subtly. The polished professionalism remained, but something colder showed through. Mrs. Price, some histories are better left undisturbed. The Crawford family has been very patient, but our patience has limits. It would be unwise to become too invested in matters that don't concern you. He stood to leave, placing his business card on the table. Think about our offer, but don't think too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often, and they certainly don't wait for hesitant homeowners. The unspoken threat hung in the air long after his car had disappeared down Maple Street. Eleanor spent the next week at the county recorder's office, pulling deeds for every property the Crawfords had acquired over the past 50 years. The pattern that emerged was both systematic and chilling. Time after time, the same sequence played out. A local business owner would face unexpected financial trouble, often following rumors or regulatory problems. Then the Crawford holding companies would acquire their property at foreclosure auctions for pennies on the dollar. The Wheeler case wasn't unique. It was part of a decades-long pattern of absorbing valuable properties through what appeared to be coordinated pressure campaigns. She found 3 other families who had vanished around the same time as the Wheelers, all of whom had properties acquired by Crawford entities shortly afterward. The official explanations ranged from relocated out of state to no forwarding address, but the timing was too consistent to be coincidence. One name stood out: the Millers, who owned a prime commercial property downtown. Their daughter had been engaged to marry Lawrence Crawford Jr. in 1975, but the engagement was suddenly broken. 6 months later, the Miller family business was facing multiple lawsuits and regulatory investigations. They sold their property to a Crawford holding company and left town abruptly. Neighbors quoted in old newspapers mentioned financial troubles and wanting a fresh start, but the sequence felt too familiar. Another case from 1988 involved a family who had opposed a Crawford development project. They experienced a mysterious series of setbacks. Their restaurant failed health inspections repeatedly. Their suppliers suddenly canceled contracts, and their children were harassed at school. They eventually sold their home and business to, of course, a Crawford entity and moved away. The timeline showed the Crawford method evolving over decades, growing more sophisticated but following the same essential pattern: identify valuable assets, apply pressure until the owners became vulnerable, then acquire the property through seemingly legitimate channels. The Wheelers were just one chapter in a much longer story of systematic acquisition. Returning to the hidden room with new determination, Eleanor began a methodical search of every surface. Using a flashlight at sharp angles to highlight irregularities, she noticed something she'd missed before: a section of wall behind the shelves that appeared slightly different in texture. The mortar between the stones looked newer, less weathered than the surrounding masonry. Carefully removing the shelves, she used a small chisel to probe the suspicious section. The mortar gave way easily, revealing that someone had indeed repaired this section relatively recently. Behind it, she found not more wall, but a small compartment containing a metal file box sealed with a combination lock. It took her 3 days of trying possible combinations based on dates from the Wheeler documents before the lock clicked open. Inside, she found the missing pieces of the puzzle, neatly organized evidence that Thomas Wheeler had been gathering against the Crawfords. There were photographs of trucks moving, suspicious cargo in and out of his warehouse late at night, with ledger pages showing payments from Crawford accounts. Copies of documents with Lawrence Crawford Sr.'s signature authorizing special transactions. Most damningly, there were cassette tapes labeled with dates and the names of Crawford associates, along with a small portable recorder. But the most chilling contents were newspaper clippings about accidents and suicides involving people who had crossed the Crawfords. A business rival who drowned in a hunting accident, a journalist who wrote critical articles and died in a car crash, a former employee who fell from a building shortly before testifying in an investigation. Thomas Wheeler had been collecting evidence of a pattern that went far beyond financial pressure. He'd stumbled into something truly dangerous. At the very bottom of the box, Eleanor found a sealed envelope addressed, "To whoever finds this." Inside, a handwritten note from Thomas Wheeler explained everything. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to my family. The Crawfords have involved me in activities I cannot describe here. I've hidden this evidence in the hope that someday someone will hold them accountable. They think they own this town, but they don't own the truth." That night, Eleanor was awakened by a sound from downstairs, the distinct creak of the basement door opening. She lay frozen in bed, listening to footsteps moving through the house below. They weren't trying to be quiet, moving with purpose rather than stealth. She heard the sound of drawers opening and closing in the kitchen, then footsteps descending to the basement. Peering through her bedroom door crack, she saw flashlight beams moving in the darkness below. They were searching for something, and she knew exactly what. The hidden room. She heard the distinctive sound of the steel door opening, then frustrated murmuring as they apparently found the empty compartment where the metal box had been. She stayed hidden until she heard them leave about 20 minutes later. Nothing appeared to be stolen. They hadn't taken her television or computer. This wasn't a burglary. It was a message. When she checked the basement, she found the hidden room door standing open, the shelves slightly disturbed. They'd found what she'd found, but she had what they wanted. The next morning, she went to the local police station. The officer at the desk listened politely until she mentioned the Crawford name. His expression changed immediately. "Ma'am, we get calls about the Crawfords all the time," he said with practiced patience. "People see their success and imagine all sorts of conspiracy theories, unless you have evidence of an actual crime." When she mentioned the break-in, he took a report, but made it clear they considered it low priority. "Old houses make strange noises," he said. "Are you sure you didn't just hear the furnace kicking on? We get a lot of those calls from new homeowners." His dismissive attitude made it clear she wouldn't find help there. That evening, she noticed the same dark sedan parked down the street, but this time it didn't leave. As night fell, it was still there, a silent reminder that she was being watched. For the first time, Eleanor understood how Thomas Wheeler must have felt in those final days, trapped, watched, and utterly alone with a truth too dangerous to share. Eleanor spread Thomas Wheeler's evidence across her kitchen table, the financial records, the journal, the photographs, the cassette tapes. Each piece told part of a story that had ended in tragedy 50 years earlier. She thought about the Wheeler family, Thomas trying to save his business, Margaret protecting their son, Daniel, who should have grown up to have a family of his own. They'd been erased because they knew too much. Her own situation mirrored theirs in uncomfortable ways. The financial pressure, the polite offers to buy her out, the veiled threats, the surveillance. The Crawford playbook hadn't changed in 50 years because it kept working. They identified vulnerable targets and applied pressure until resistance became impossible. She thought about taking the money and disappearing like the previous owners had. The Crawford offer would solve all her financial problems. She could pay off debts, buy a nice condo, never worry about money again. But then she looked at the photograph of the Wheeler family smiling on the porch, unaware of what was coming for them. They'd taken the money too, and it had cost them everything. Her husband's words came back to her from a conversation years earlier when he'd talked about why he became a teacher instead of pursuing more lucrative work. Some things are more important than money, Ellie. Doing what's right matters, even when it's hard. He'd believed in justice, in standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. That night, she made her decision sitting at the same kitchen table where Thomas Wheeler had likely made his final plans. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't take the Crawford money. She would do what Thomas couldn't. She would make sure the truth didn't disappear with her. The risk terrified her, but the thought of doing nothing terrified her more. The Wheelers had been alone, but she had evidence they never did, and she knew how to use it. Eleanor sat at the library's microfilm machine, the green glow casting shadows across her determined face. The Crawford name appeared everywhere once she knew what to look for. Lawrence Crawford Sr.'s portrait smiled from the society pages of the 1960s, always at charity galas, political fundraisers, ribbon-cutting ceremonies. The family's influence wasn't just financial. It was woven into the town's very infrastructure. She found Crawford representatives on the school board, the zoning commission, the hospital foundation. Their construction company had built half the municipal buildings in town. Their bank held mortgages on most of the commercial properties. Their real estate arm owned entire blocks of rental housing. It was an ecosystem of control, each part supporting the others, creating a structure that seemed impenetrable from the outside. The newspaper archives revealed the pattern of quiet domination. When the Crawfords wanted a property, they got it. When they supported a political candidate, that candidate won. When they opposed something, a competing business, an inconvenient regulation, it somehow disappeared from public discussion. The few critical articles that appeared were always followed by retractions or sudden editorial changes. At the Historical Society, the elderly archivist lowered his voice when Eleanor showed him the Crawford name in her notes. "They don't just own property," he whispered, glancing toward the door. "They own people, cops, judges, reporters. My cousin worked for their construction company in the 70s. Said they had a special fund for municipal relations. That's what they called the payoffs." Property records showed the Crawford holding companies had acquired 14 properties in the 5 years following the Wheelers' disappearance, all at foreclosure auctions, all for suspiciously low prices. The previous owners had various stories: sudden business failures, family emergencies, relocation for health reasons. But the pattern was too consistent, the timing too convenient. The most chilling discovery came from cross-referencing dates. 3 weeks before Thomas Wheeler's final journal entry, the City Council had approved rezoning for a Crawford development project that would require acquiring several properties, including the Wheeler warehouse. The vote was unanimous, with no discussion recorded in the minutes. The Wheelers hadn't just been inconvenient, they'd been in the way of progress, Crawford style. Returning to the hidden room with new purpose, Eleanor examined every inch with a flashlight held at sharp angles. The wall behind the shelves looked different. The mortar between the stones appeared newer, less weathered. Using a putty knife, she carefully scraped at the suspicious section. The mortar crumbled easily, revealing that someone had patched over this area relatively recently. Behind the false wall, her fingers found a metal box sealed with a combination lock. It took 3 days of trying dates from the Wheeler documents before the lock clicked open on March 28, 1972, the date of their final bank withdrawal. Inside, she found Thomas Wheeler's insurance policy against the Crawfords, neatly organized evidence that told a much darker story than she'd imagined. Photographs showed trucks moving suspicious cargo in and out of his warehouse at night. Crates marked with military designations, items that didn't match his furniture business inventory. Ledger pages showed payments from Crawford accounts with cryptic notations, storage fees, transportation services, special, handling. There were copies of documents bearing Lawrence Crawford Sr.'s signature, authorizing what appeared to be arms shipments disguised as furniture exports. Most damningly, there were cassette tapes labeled with dates and the names of Crawford associates, along with a small portable recorder that still worked when she tested it with fresh batteries. But the contents that made her blood run cold were the newspaper clippings about accidents and suicides. A business rival who opposed a Crawford development drowned in a hunting accident. A journalist investigating Crawford business practices died in a single car crash. A former Crawford accountant fell from a building window weeks before testifying to a grand jury. Thomas hadn't just stumbled into financial corruption. He'd uncovered something far more dangerous. At the very bottom, a sealed envelope addressed to whoever finds this contained Thomas's final message. If you're reading this, then they've made good on their threats. The Crawfords are moving illegal weapons through my business. When I tried to back out, they threatened my family. I've hidden this evidence in the hope that someday someone will hold them accountable. They think they own this town, but they don't own the truth. That night, Eleanor was awakened by the distinct sound of the basement door opening. Not the creak of an old house settling, the precise click of a latch being turned. She lay frozen, listening to footsteps moving through the house below. They weren't trying to be quiet, moving with purpose rather than stealth. Drawers opened and closed in the kitchen, then footsteps descended to the basement. Peering through her bedroom door crack, she saw flashlight beams moving in the darkness below. They were searching for something specific. She heard the distinctive sound of the steel door opening, then frustrated murmuring as they found the empty compartment where the metal box had been. She stayed hidden until she heard them leave about 20 minutes later. Nothing was stolen. They hadn't taken her television or laptop. This wasn't a burglary. It was a message. When she checked the basement, she found the hidden room door standing open, the shelves slightly disturbed. They'd found what she'd found, but she had what they wanted. The next morning, she went to the local police station. The officer at the desk listened politely until she mentioned the Crawford name. His expression changed immediately. "Ma'am, we get calls about the Crawfords all the time," he said with practiced patience. "People see their success and imagine conspiracy theories. Unless you have evidence of an actual crime." When she described the break-in, he took a report but made it clear they considered it low priority. "Old houses make strange noises," he said. "Are you sure you didn't just hear the furnace kicking on?" We get a lot of those calls from new homeowners. His dismissive attitude made it clear she wouldn't find help there. That evening, the dark sedan was back, but this time it didn't leave. As night fell, it remained parked down the street, a silent reminder that she was being watched. For the first time, Eleanor understood how Thomas Wheeler must have felt in those final days, trapped, watched, and utterly alone with a truth too dangerous to share. Eleanor spread Thomas Wheeler's evidence across her kitchen table, the financial records, the journal, the photographs, the cassette tapes. Each piece told part of a story that had ended in tragedy 50 years earlier. She thought about the Wheeler family, Thomas trying to save his business, Margaret protecting their son, Daniel, who should have grown up to have a family of his own. They'd been erased because they knew too much. Her own situation mirrored theirs in uncomfortable ways. The financial pressure, the polite offers to buy her out, the veiled threats, the surveillance. The Crawford playbook hadn't changed in 50 years because it kept working. They identified vulnerable targets and applied pressure until resistance became impossible. She thought about taking the money and disappearing like the previous owners had. The Crawford offer would solve all her financial problems. She could pay off debts, buy a nice condo, never worry about money again. But then she looked at the photograph of the Wheeler family, smiling on the porch, unaware of what was coming for them. They'd taken the money too, and it had cost them everything. Her husband's words came back to her from a conversation years earlier when he'd talked about why he became a teacher instead of pursuing more lucrative work. Some things are more important than money, Ellie. Doing what's right matters, even when it's hard. He'd believed in justice, in standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. That night, she made her decision sitting at the same kitchen table where Thomas Wheeler had likely made his final plans. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't take the Crawford money. She would do what Thomas couldn't. She would make sure the truth didn't disappear with her. The risk terrified her, but the thought of doing nothing terrified her more. The Wheelers had been alone, but she had evidence they never did, and she knew how to use it. Eleanor lay in bed that night, the house around her too quiet, the silence itself feeling watchful. She'd placed Thomas Wheeler's metal box in 3 different hiding spots around the house before finally settling on burying it in a waterproof container in the backyard, beneath the rose bushes her husband had always loved. The journal she kept separate, wrapped in plastic and hidden inside a hollowed-out book on her shelf. She'd made digital copies of everything, storing them on encrypted drives she'd mailed to herself at a P.O. box in the next town over. Every precaution felt necessary yet insufficient. Around 2 a.m., the sound of breaking glass shattered the stillness. Not the dramatic crash of a window, but the precise crack of a single pane being carefully removed. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Footsteps moved through her kitchen with practiced quiet. Not the random searching of before, but purposeful movement toward specific locations. She heard drawers opening, the sound of her desk being searched, the gentle scrape of furniture being moved. Sliding silently from bed, she peered through the crack in her doorway. 2 figures dressed in black moved through her living room with flashlight beams focused on specific areas, behind paintings, under furniture, exactly where someone might hide important documents. They were professionals, not just thugs. When one of them started up the stairs, Eleanor retreated to her closet, pulling the door nearly closed just as a beam of light swept across her bedroom. She heard the quiet rustle of her dresser drawers being searched, the sound of her mattress being lifted slightly. Then the footsteps descended again. 20 minutes later, she heard the faint click of her front door closing. When she finally dared to emerge, she found her home meticulously searched, but nothing taken. The message was clear. They knew she had the evidence, and they would keep coming until they found it. The next morning, she went to the police station again, this time with photographs of the broken window latch and disturbed areas of her home. The same officer listened with that practiced patience that felt more like dismissal. "Ma'am, nothing was taken, you said. No forced entry except that little window latch? Could have been the wind. Or maybe a raccoon got in. These old houses." When she mentioned the Crawford name again, his expression closed completely. "I think you might be letting your imagination run away with you. Maybe the stress of the move, being alone in that big old house." His patronizing tone made her want to scream. She left knowing what Thomas Wheeler had known 50 years earlier. The local authorities were either compromised or willfully blind when it came to the Crawford family. That evening, the dark sedan was back, but this time there were two men inside who made no attempt to hide their surveillance. They sat watching her house, occasionally speaking into radios. When she stepped onto her porch, one of them raised binoculars to watch her openly. The intimidation had shifted from subtle to overt, the pressure increasing daily. Mrs. Gable from across the street brought over a fresh loaf of bread, her expression worried. "Eleanor, dear," she said quietly, "those men have been there all day. Maybe you should think about that offer you got. Some battles aren't worth fighting." Even her well-meaning neighbor had been drawn into the campaign of pressure. That night, Eleanor lay awake staring at the ceiling, the reality of her situation settling over her like a cold weight. She was completely alone against a powerful machine that had been perfecting its methods for decades. The Crawfords didn't need to break down her door. They would gradually isolate her, intimidate her, and wait for her to either hand over the evidence or make a mistake that let them take it. The system was designed to make resistance feel impossible, exactly as it had for Thomas Wheeler. The next morning, Eleanor began her counteroffensive with methodical precision. She started with the evidence Thomas Wheeler had collected, creating a digital archive that could never be completely destroyed. Each document was scanned at high resolution, each photograph carefully photographed with a scale reference. Each cassette tape digitized using equipment she rented from the university library. She created multiple copies on encrypted drives, storing them in different locations. A safety deposit box in a bank 2 towns over, a trusted friend's house in another state, even burying one in a waterproof container in the woods beyond her property. The originals she kept moving between hiding places, never in the same spot twice. Next, she turned to modern technology that Thomas Wheeler never had access to. She installed hidden cameras around her property, carefully concealed in birdhouses, porch ornaments, and garden decorations. Motion activated, cloud connected, they would capture anyone approaching her home. She set up a security system that alerted her phone directly, bypassing any monitoring service that might be compromised. Her research expanded beyond the historical records. Using skills from her former accounting career, she began tracing the Crawford business empire through contemporary records, shell companies, offshore accounts, property transfers. She followed the money with a forensic accountant's eye, building a modern picture to complement the historical evidence Wheeler had collected. She reached out cautiously to the few people who might help. a retired investigative journalist who had written about corruption in the 1980s, now living in Florida. A former Crawford employee who had left under mysterious circumstances. A law professor who specialized in organized crime patterns. Each contact was made through secure channels, each conversation carefully measured to avoid revealing too much too soon. The most promising connection came through the retired journalist who put her in touch with a former FBI agent named Michael Evans. Now working as a private investigator, Evans had spent years tracking organized crime networks that used legitimate businesses as fronts. When Eleanor shared some of the financial patterns she'd uncovered, his response was immediate and serious. "This looks familiar," he told her during their encrypted video call. "The pattern matches operations we saw with certain crime families, using struggling businesses to move and clean money, then absorbing them when they become inconvenient." Evans helped her structure the evidence in ways that would be useful to authorities outside the Crawfords' influence. He explained how to create a timeline that showed the pattern of behavior, how to document the chain of custody for evidence, and most importantly, how to identify which agencies might actually investigate rather than cover up. Meanwhile, the pressure campaign continued. Strange hang-up calls at all hours, cars following her when she drove to the grocery store, a dead bird left on her porch one morning. Each incident was documented, photographed, added to the growing evidence file. She stopped answering her landline, used cash for purchases, and varied her routines to avoid predictable patterns. The breakthrough came when she discovered the modern equivalent of Thomas Wheeler's operation. Using property records and business filings, she found 3 current local businesses that showed the same pattern. Sudden financial trouble, Crawford loans appearing, strange transactions happening after hours. She began discreetly reaching out to these business owners, careful not to reveal too much, just feeling out whether they might be experiencing similar pressure. One of them, a furniture store owner named Mark, broke down during their conversation. "They're going to take everything," he said, his voice shaking. "The loans, the inspections, the accidents. It never stops. My wife wants me to just walk away, but this business was my father's." His story mirrored Thomas Wheeler's so closely it made her shudder. Eleanor realized she wasn't just fighting for justice for a family that disappeared 50 years ago. She was fighting to prevent the same thing from happening to families today. The Crawford machine was still operating, still destroying lives, still absorbing businesses and properties through the same ruthless methods. She compiled everything into a master file: the historical evidence from Wheeler, the modern financial patterns, the witness statements from current victims, the documentation of harassment she'd experienced. Evans helped her identify which federal agencies had the jurisdiction and independence to actually investigate: the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, even certain congressional committees that monitored organized crime. The final piece came when she discovered that Lawrence Crawford Jr. was planning to run for Congress next year. His campaign was already underway, with polls showing him as the favorite. The timing explained the increased pressure. They couldn't afford any scandals emerging during the campaign. They needed her evidence buried, just like they'd needed the Wheelers disappeared 50 years earlier. Eleanor prepared multiple packages of evidence, ready to be sent to different agencies and news organizations simultaneously. She set up dead man switches, digital triggers that would release the information if she didn't check in regularly. She was no longer just preserving history. She was building a case that could actually stop the Crawford machine from destroying more lives. The house that had once felt like a financial burden had become the center of a quiet revolution. In the same rooms where Thomas Wheeler had likely felt trapped and hopeless, Eleanor was methodically assembling the tools to break the cycle. She worked late into the nights, the glow of her computer screen the only light in the old Victorian, compiling evidence that could finally bring justice for the Wheelers and protection for whoever might have been next. Working with Michael Evans, we prepared a comprehensive package for the federal investigators. The evidence spanned 50 years: Thomas Wheeler's original documents, my financial analysis, recorded testimonies from current business owners being pressured, and the surveillance footage from my property. We sent identical packages to the FBI, IRS, and a congressional oversight committee simultaneously. The response was faster than we anticipated. Within 48 hours, federal agents were quietly interviewing people around town, and the dark sedan watching my house was replaced by an unmarked surveillance van, this time on my side. The financial reward came through the whistleblower programs. Because my evidence led to the recovery of substantial assets from Crawford shell companies and the resolution of multiple cold cases, I received a percentage that erased every financial worry I'd ever had. It was more than enough to properly restore the house, not as a burden, but as a home. I hired craftsmen who specialized in historical restoration, and we repaired the sagging porches, refinished the original hardwood, and brought the beautiful old Victorian back to its intended glory. But the true transformation wasn't financial. It was the profound sense of peace that settled over me as the Crawford family faced indictment after indictment. Lawrence Crawford Jr.'s political ambitions evaporated overnight. Their empire, built on intimidation and hidden crimes, began to crumble under the weight of truth. The house, once a place of fear and isolation, became my sanctuary. For the first time since my husband's passing, I felt a sense of purpose that filled the silence with meaning instead of grief. I turned the hidden room into a small study, a place of quiet reflection. On the shelf, I placed the photograph of the Wheeler family, finally honoring their memory in the home they loved. The house stopped being the place where a family vanished and became the place where their story was finally told. It finally felt like a true home, its history acknowledged and its future secured. I sit on my restored porch now, not with fear, but with a quiet contentment, knowing that ordinary courage can indeed change everything.